You know, it's very interesting. You know, we have this interesting political dialogue going on in the States today, and sometimes things that are really important get over-politicized. And so I'm going right there at the beginning, right? And that is Space Force. You're in Austin. I live in Austin. We kind of can guess some political stuff going on here. And yet at the same time, I'm incredibly honored that Lamont has asked me to join the Doctrine organizational group. I was going to say advisory group, see? We're called the DOG. And there's a group of us that have been brought together to work on the core doctrine. Now, when they were putting this concept together, they needed somebody of great brilliance and with a huge understanding of history and all the threads therein, and that's why this gentleman is in charge. And Lamont, you know, I'm talking about this sort of shallow political stuff, but you know, it is a question that comes up, especially from people, shall we say, on the left side,
Sure.
the Democratic side. So outside of the fact of who started it, why do we need a Space Force?
Yeah, and I think that question is asked a lot, right? And so Space Force comes into being in 2019. It's associated with President Trump. There were some in the media that immediately wanted to call it a Trump vanity project, which is out there as a phrase, which is really unfortunate. And so instead of focusing on why we need a Space Force, they focused almost entirely on the president of the time and whatever their feelings were, pro or anti-him. So, I mean, the story of the Space Force is really a story that goes back decades and decades and decades. In fact, the first time you and I met, pre-Space Force, I was giving a talk as a professor about the need to have an independent service. And so that was obviously before we had one. And the reasons for that haven't changed, right? So to have a branch of the military that is devoted to space entirely and to space assets that are looking towards Earth, around Earth, and outward, instead of having baggage from other services that have other primary missions and primary functions, and to integrate space national security into one branch so that it is the focal point, is still the core reason for what was needed and argued about in the beginning and why it exists today. And that is to defend American national vital interests in and around space, and also our values in and around space. I think all of that has to be combined, because after all, it's the United States military. It's not China. It's not Russia.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to them.
Sure.
So, and by the way, Colonel Pete Garrettson, who was going to be here, I don't know if she mentioned that, but he's had some flight delays, and that's why we're one-on-one instead of one-on-two. But I'll use that to make the point that for a long time, there have been a lot of people who have had the vision and understood that as we go into space, while we do not want to carry some of our worst attributes with us, we may not have the choice in terms of what other people do. And for a long time, Pete Warden, Garrettson, and several others were working in the background to try and make this happen. One way I kind of talk about it is and you can take it either way you want it, but the past president was, in a sense, their Isabella, right? They had an idea to chart a voyage, and they found somebody who would do it. Right. Because it preceded President Trump by a long, long way. And so it is good. I mean, we've got it, we're going. There's been a lot of pushback that I've been aware of internally with the old services. And there's been some vision. You want to address that? Explain what you're navigating?
Yeah, I think, the phrase that we are using that I think is very much a good phrase to understand the role of Space Force is we're calling it the dual mandate. And the dual mandate is a mandate that says, on the one hand, the United States Space Force has to be first concerned about the terrestrial fight, what is going to happen on Earth. And as our primary mission there, it's going to be to support the services that exist prior to the Space Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, Coast Guard, et cetera, and the Air Force, to ensure American interests on Earth. The second part of that mandate is equally important, and that is the celestial mandate. So beyond Earth, how can American interests and values be the dominant factor in space, and our allies, right? So that's a critical component to this. This is not the United States alone. This is the United States and its democratic allies. And so that dual mandate, I think the battle tends to be is there's elements within the military and within government that are more focused on mandate one, it's all about Earth and the terrestrial fight. Mandate two, forget that, it's all about the celestial fight and outer space. And in reality, and I talk about this in a book that will be coming out in a couple of weeks, it's the synthesis that cannot exist without each other. You cannot win the terrestrial fight without the support from space, and you certainly can't win the celestial fight unless the other services are on board with you as well. So this bizarre artificial divide that some people call the look down, look up people, that has to be destroyed. That thinking doesn't make any sense. There are people in and outside government that maybe enhance that or amplify that divide, but that divide is unnecessary. You cannot do one without the other. It is a synthesis that has to move forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I mean, any students of history, we will have seen this in the past as new technologies. Of course, the one that springs to mind is the arrival of aircraft, and some of the ideas that military leaders at the time had as to that utility. Right. You know, which had nothing to do with it. Well, it was in there, but very little to do with what we ended up getting. You want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, there has to be a lot of forward thinking in Space Force. And you know, in my job of doctrine, the military has tended to define doctrine as past practices, lessons learned of the past, and whatever the existing capabilities are, how that is managed at that time. That generally is, by the way, not how the word is used in any other way, shape, or form. So getting back to its original idea of how doctrine should be used, we don't have a lot of past practices. Luckily, we don't have a space war to have tested theories on. We don't have a space conflict. And by the way, to a large degree, to avoid that will be a victory for Space Force.
Yeah.
So in other words, to create the architecture and the service that is forward-leaning and that is going to guarantee that dual mandate for America and her allies, the ultimate success in that will not to have those conflicts and not to have those wars. But that's going to require the support of not just Congress, not just the president, not just the military, but the electorate as well. And I think that's a whole untold story if you want to look at, but that's a very critical component to this. So when we look at today, what I've talked about in other venues is if you were a military or strategic analyst in, say, 1904, and you were in 1904 to have made the argument that there's going to be a potential future conflict 30, 40 years later, and that conflict in one of the two theaters will be dominated by a seaborne platform that is able to launch airplanes from that platform, and that the entire Pacific War, as it turned out to be, will be primarily determined by that technology and that idea, you would have probably been laughed out of the room. So let's prevent the laughter now. Let's ensure that we don't go there. Let's prevent the space Pearl Harbor. Let's prevent the space 9/11 by having the architecture and the system and the ideas, the concepts, the doctrine in place so we don't have to have that experience again. Yeah.
And you know, one of the things I've been finding too, in almost all of my encounters with sort of the hands-on elements and people managing Space Force and working in there is a lot of receptivity to ideas, a lot of, there isn't an aggressive tendency at all. It's completely different from that. There's a great openness, to different things, and the Guardians, which I thought should be called Spacers, and wrote an article about. I lost that one. Yeah, I lost that one, but Guardians is cool. It's all right. They are coming into this with a vitality and an excitement, and part of, I guess, finally the military has a job description for nerds.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
And what is your experience in terms of the young people that are coming on board? And,
Yeah, I think with the new generation of enlisted and officers, you do see a fundamental shift and change in I think their attitude. And that one of the reasons why Space Force had to come into being and to separate itself out is because of it's a new domain. It's the harshest domain possible. It's a view of the way things need to work that none of the current services could possibly handle. And so there had to be, and there continues to need to be a cultural shift. And that will be difficult, and it is difficult, right? Because so many of the people who are in positions in the Space Force were somewhere else before, but it was an institution. So you have that institutional legacy that's ingrained in them. And some of that has to be fought. With the newer people coming in, well, they're coming in fresh. And so there's going to be there is a period, I think, of tension. It doesn't have to be truly negative, because from tension, sometimes great things can happen. But there has to be that shift. And as Space Force becomes ever more independent, that will be necessary, because we're just looking at a whole different world in some ways. Now, I would go in another direction also. In many ways, we are standing on an edge that we haven't really stood on since the 14 to 1500s. And so the way people were thinking about how to deal with exploration, how to deal with logistics, how to deal with communication, there are parallels in the human experience already. And it's the frontier with the Wild West, which I know you've talked about quite a bit, and there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also even prior events in human history that we need to draw upon for the good lessons and the bad lessons. Yeah.
So you've been doing these workshop type things. You want to talk a little about that, how we're getting that extra input? I've attended a couple of them, and several of them, but
yeah. So where we first met was at the first Space Futures Workshop. And so this is a program that originally was under Air Force Space Command, and now it's Space Force. And what we tried to do there in the first iteration of this is to go out to 2060. So what are the possibilities at 2060? And we eventually wrote a report. It's unclassified. You can Google it. 2060 Space Futures Report. I would highly recommend reading it if you want to get a sense of where we think we will be at 2060. We came up with 8 scenarios. 3 of them are pretty good for the United States and democratic values and our allies. 2 of them are okay. 3 of them are negative. 2 of them are super negative.
Yep.
So the reason why I think it made sense to go out to 2060 first, instead of going the other direction, and then work backward, is now we know what to avoid, now we know what we want, now we want to pursue that, right? So we want to pursue a vibrant space economy, first thing, variable. Second variable is you want to have a large human presence in space. And the third variable is the Western allies are in the leadership position of that, right? Democratic values and what some people refer to as the international liberal order. And that's the ultimate future of the 2060. Then there's variance all the way down to total violence and chaos with nobody running it. Then there's another scenario where there is a power that's running things, but it's Russia or China, right? So we know the negative possible futures, we know the positive ones. Then we work back in the next iteration to 2040. The report on that is going to eventually get published. And in that one, we used what we call images of future operations to try to create scenarios of what could happen in 2040 as that midpoint between now and 2060. And of course, now what we're doing is we're looking at the period from now to around 2025, 27, 28, 2030. And that's, again, more focused on how the Space Force is going to deal with the terrestrial issue. But, you know, Space Force is looking at 3 regimes, right? The geocentric regime, which is where we are now, primarily LEO and GEO. The next is cislunar, and the third is solar. And so we already have in our mindset those 3 regimes that we need to keep looking at of how does Space Force react and deal with an arena that is geocentric right now, cislunar next, and solar ultimately.
Okay, so let's go for a little more fun now.
Yeah.
What about the moon? What do you think? What is our strategic interest? What do you think, without getting your job in trouble, although you've been very bold, what do you think we should be focused on in terms of the moon?
Yeah. I think you're going to hear a very good presentation by Dr. Goswami about China's intentions. And so as we look at the intentions of the bad actors in international affairs, China and Russia, we look at medium problematic actors, North Korea, Iran, as examples, and then we look at potential non-state actors, whether they're terrorist organizations or criminal syndicates or just individual actions. The United States is going to have to make a determination, and Space Force is going to have to be the ultimate part of that equation, of how to bring a sense of law and order and the protection of private property into space. And one of the things, I think I talked about this the first time I addressed New Worlds before I was in Space Force, is all of the visions that all of you have created, right? This amazing ideas that will change the high frontier from commercial and business actions. All of that is wonderful, and it's going to push humanity forward, but it will not be able to happen unless it is the United States and her allies that are the leading force. It just won't. And if the Space Force doesn't do that, that vacuum will be filled. There's no choice. There's not another option. That vacuum will be filled by China and Russia and a combination of malevolent non-state actors that are beholden to no one but themselves. And therefore, as we look to the moon and we look at all of these amazing ideas of bases and colonies and resource acquisition and transportation links, and that will occur just as it did in the West, right? As long as there is some ability to create security and safety for a human presence. And that security and safety is going to have to be under democratic values, because it certainly will not be protected by a regime like China, Russia, or others.
Yeah, great. And so, at the end of the day, we're taking care of the terrestrial battlefield that we hope we don't have to. We're looking at protection for humanity. And just to wrap us up sort of on a high point then, do you feel that Space Force and its allies will have a role in the expansion of humanity into the solar system? Now, that could be what we're already seeing with SpaceWorks and Outworks in terms of investing. But do you see any sort of physicality, development of capabilities, things like that, that would enhance the ability of human beings to expand?
Well, I think one of the internal debates in Space Force is, will Space Force have, for lack of a better term, a constabulary role in space? And so originally, one of the arguments that was being pushed forward before Space Force came to existence was, instead of having Space Force, let's have a Space Guard. So the model was the Coast Guard in space. I think now that we have Space Force, that aspect of a Space Guard probably will eventually fall under the Space Force. And if it does, then that will create that security and safety. And that could be ultimately positive for everybody. It won't just be positive for the United States. It'll be positive for humanity in general. And that umbrella of an optimistic and positive future is, I think, where the United States shines as you know, our values and our ideas envelop that universe. That creates that optimistic future for everybody here in this room.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you
Good
for
deal.
sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you.